Game 8 of the World Chess Championship was played today in New York, and what a sensational encounter this was. We joined the game after 27 moves. Black has just played the pawn to h6. So Carlsen with white, Karjakin with black. And it was a pretty safe opening from Magnus Carlsen. He played actually the so-called Zuckertort variation with d4 and e3 and then b3. But pawns were traded early and not such an interesting position. Karjakin had a couple of chances to maybe seize the initiative, but once again he played absolute safety first chess. And in this position you can see that black has a pretty solid pawn structure, no weaknesses at all. Pieces are pretty harmoniously placed. Now the only thing is, let's compare with white's position. Well, Carlsen has two very nice minor pieces. He split his pawns. He recaptured on c4, and by doing this I think he's hoping that maybe he can use this pawn lever at some moment, but also the pawn covers d5, and you can see Carlsen has control of the d file but not much chance to do anything at the moment. So all in all, actually quite a balanced position. Here Carlsen started to play very ambitiously. I was expecting, after Karjakin's h6 to give the king an escape square, I was expecting Carlsen to play in kind and play h3 and perhaps even put his king on h2 before potentially advancing the kingside pawns. But instead Carlsen played f4 straight away. Very ambitious move indeed, particularly as he was starting to run a little bit short of time, and Karjakin as well. The knight came back to d7, and here was why Carlsen forced the knight back, because now he can get his knight in and can spin back to this nice square. But this moment the Russian started to defend very actively, perhaps I should say counter-attack. So the queen comes in, looking at a4, potentially looking at maybe a check down here, also looking at this weak pawn e3. And I mean, this is why I was quite surprised that Carlsen played f4, because it does loosen his king position, no doubt about it. But Carlsen had clearly kind of intended this. The knight spun to a good square, hitting the rook, and the rook came to f8, defending that important pawn. Around about this time, with 10 moves to go to the time control at move 40, Carlsen had roughly 6 minutes remaining, and Karjakin had just under 8 minutes. So slight time advantage for the Russian. Now, if Carlsen wanted to play safely here, he could have taken this and got two minor pieces for the rook. Now, in this position, black's queen is looking pretty good, counterattacks very well. So black has rook and two pawns against bishop and knight, but because the queen and rook prevent the rook joining in the attack and the bishop blocks a few checks, I think this position should be a draw. So if Carlsen wanted to play safely, he could have done that. Instead he played h3. Well, not a bad idea, giving the king a nice square on h2, but I mean, it gives black the chance to play, for example, knight c5. Black could have taken on a4. Not so good this one, because then queen b2 is a nice move. It's kind of trapping the queen in, threatening c5 with a nice discovered attack, and then, well, knight c5 is forced, but this is getting a bit tricky. So again, Karjakin played, I think, a good defensive move. The knight came to c5, but that does cut off the queen from the defence on the king side. Very cool move from Carlsen. King h2, just putting his king to safety before moving ahead further with his attack. knight a4, very cool. Takes from Karjakin, taking off the pawn, and that allows the queen to come back to defend. And now here, with the black pieces, slightly on the side of the board, I think it's possible for Carlsen to advance through the middle with e4. I think that gives white quite a strong initiative, certainly enough compensation for a pawn. But instead, rook d8 played. Well, this also gives white some initiative. For example, if this is taken, then the knight comes in to attack f7, and that must give white sufficient play. So Karjakin played g6, played very pragmatically, just giving his king some room. And now, clock times, just over 2 minutes for Carlsen, 3 minutes for Karjakin. Now maybe Carlsen should have just brought the knight back, and then just brought the queen back, the rook back. Just holding the position for a bit, because this knight is rather stranded. Instead he played queen d4, hitting the knight. King came to g7, and now again, if he just nudged back his rook, just maintaining his pieces in strong positions, then this should give white sufficient play for a pawn, because this knight isn't so well placed. But here Carlsen played an incredibly reckless move, c5. This is a make or break move, this is a blitz move. Now, easy for black to go wrong here. For example, if knight c5, then suddenly the knight is hanging on f6, or queen takes c5, then queen takes a4. Black is probably just about okay there, but still a blunder. But the Russian, very cool under pressure, played rook takes rook, and after knight takes rook, just played knight takes c5. So black is 2 pawns up here, but the queen is a long way from the king. Carlsen moved in. Threat, he wants to play queen e7 and gets it on f7. And now, crunch moment in the game. Karjakin down to his final couple of minutes. He blundered. He could have played queen a4 just to bring the queen back to one of these squares, and this should be very promising for black. So for example, after queen takes pawn, well, the knight comes back and suddenly black's position is secure. Very good winning chances. Still not absolutely 100%, still a bit of difficulty on this diagonal, but should be good for black. Instead, Karjakin played queen d3. Looks good at first glance. If the queen comes here, then this one comes back to d7 to defend, but knight takes e6 check from Carlsen. Of course, knight takes knight, queen takes queen, and if king moves to the side, then, well, this is also sufficient for white. So this was taken by the Russian. Queen e7 check. So they're still not at the time control yet. Now this is move 40. So now they've got time to think. But the queen right in the face of black's king. This should be enough for Carlsen. He played e4. Good move. So now the queen no longer protects g6. But it's really on the edge, this position. If Carlsen doesn't succeed in getting a perpetual check, or perhaps more, with the queen, then of course this a pawn is steaming through. Queen d7, bringing the queen back to defend. Queen takes g6, and the queen goes in the way. Queen e8 check. Now, Karjakin has to be careful with his exposed king. So for example, if he tries to escape up here, then e5, and suddenly it could be that this bishop in some cases can join the attack, and if a3, then the queen just comes behind the pawn, scoops up, and the queen just can't help. So queen f8 from Karjakin, good move. And now here, this was an extraordinary decision from Carlsen. watching this online, I just assumed he would play queen g6 check here, and probably the game would end in a draw like this, repeating the position. Although here, after queen g6 check, Karjakin can try a bit further, but it looks as though Carlsen has just enough to draw this position. This looks incredibly scary, but unbelievably, after queen b1, it's very difficult for black to actually support this pawn in a meaningful way because his king is so exposed. So, for example, after queen b8, can't play queen to a8 because of the bishop, but after queen b8, the queen simply cuts back again and perpetual check threatened. Or if queen e8, well, that prevents queen g6, but now there's an amazing variation. Queen takes pawn, so knight threatened. a2, threatening to make a queen. Now queen comes behind the pawn, and now queen a4 looks disastrous for white. Black gets a queen, but it's perpetual check. Queen f7 and so on. I mean, black is even lucky that there isn't a bishop e4 mate, but anyway, that's another story. So queen g6 looks like it should be a draw. Instead, after 10 minutes thought, Carlsen played queen c6. Now at first I thought, well, this is very brave. Maybe if black slips up, his king is quite exposed, white can maybe pick off another pawn, maybe try to win this. Queen d8, very cool defence, protecting the pawn. f5, I mean, this is quite scary. If black trades, then suddenly the bishop comes in and very nasty attack on the king. But a3, finely calculated by Karjakin. Pawn takes pawn. Now if a2, then e7 and white picks up that pawn. Is even a bit better. So king g7, very cool move. And now maybe the best move is to bring the queen back with queen b5. This looks like it should be sufficient to draw the game. This is an improved version of the game. Carlsen instead played e7 after 7 minutes thought. Looks like it should be enough to draw still. Here he played the queen to a5. Probably better to play h4 and to activate the bishop, although even here, with this rather splendidly placed knight on e5, and you know, sometimes you can get a hit on the king, not absolutely simple to draw, but should be a draw. Instead, Carlsen played queen a5. Queen c5, good move from black. Queen a6, and now knight e5. Once again, that knight is just superbly placed in the middle of the board. Makes that bishop look rather silly. You can see it's really restricted. Now, again, white should play h4, and it could be that white has just enough to hold this game. This is rather a blitz analysis, but it looks as though here black is closing in, but white makes a draw by perpetual check in this case. But instead, Carlsen played queen e6. Now, the pawn can't advance, but h5 is a really good move, an excellent move, and suddenly white is in desperate trouble. If the queen comes to f5, looking to get some kind of perpetual knight g4 check, is winning. If that's taken, queens are exchanged, and a2 on the next turn, and that's that. Carlsen played h4, and then a2, and here he resigned. Magnus Carlsen resigned the game. If queen takes pawn, knight g4 check. If the king comes back, then queen c1 and make next move. And if king h3, then queen g1, threat, queen h2 mate, and if there's no check on a7, that queen covers beautifully, and if queen b2, king comes up to g6, and again the check here is covered by the queen. And of course if bishop f3, so that protects h2, but then knight f2, winning white's queen and mate soon after. So there we go, extraordinary. Sergei Karjakin wins game 8 and goes into the lead in the World Chess Championship match. Carlsen, in this game, somehow he looked frustrated. You know, he was pushing all the time, trying to upset Karjakin. Karjakin just remained so cool. He really wasn't pushed out of his equilibrium in the whole game. He made one mistake, Karjakin, when he played queen d3 instead of queen a4 and move 37, but it wasn't a disaster, and he was still holding the position after that. Whereas Carlsen was played in a much more uneven way, pushing all the time, pushing his luck with moves like f4 when he could have played more safely. So in this case, fortune did not favour the brave, and well, we have to salute Karjakin's superb defensive play and finally an excellent counter-attack. 4 games to go, just 4 games for Magnus Carlsen to try and hit back.